Welcome. Tonight's story drifts in softly, like something half remembered, finally stepping back into the light. Part 1. Now that your son is gone, take your grief and get out, my daughter-in-law said. My name is Elaine Prescott. I was married once, loved once, and gave birth to the only child I ever had, my son, Matthew. He was the kind of man who opened doors for strangers and made pancakes from scratch every Sunday. His father passed away when Matt was only 13, and I raised him alone from there. He was my entire world, and when he met her, Samantha, I tried to be gracious. I truly did. But I saw the way she looked at him, and worse, the way she looked at me, like I was some antique. Something she had to tolerate until it was her house, her rules, her future. I didn't speak up. Not when she moved into the home I helped him buy. Not when she started slowly pulling him away, forgetting to invite me to birthdays, suddenly misplacing my messages, whispering things I wasn't supposed to hear when she thought I was out of the room. I held my tongue when she called me his precious little relic. I swallowed it all for Matt's sake, because he loved her, and he wanted peace. But then, he got sick, and suddenly, I wasn't just the unwanted guest. I was the only one who stayed up at night with him while she claimed she couldn't bear to see him like that. I cooked for him, changed his linens, sat beside him while he shivered through the worst of it. He'd squeeze my hand and whisper, "Thanks, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you." Meanwhile, Samantha was out at brunches, pretending to friends that he was just under the weather. The day he passed, she wasn't even in the house. I was the one who found him. I was the one who called the doctor, the funeral home, the relatives. She showed up only hours later, makeup perfect, eyes dry. She glanced at me in the hallway, then walked into the bedroom like she owned it. And 3 days later, after the funeral, after the condolences had faded into silence, she came down the stairs while I was folding Matthew's clothes for donation, and said it. Now that your son is gone, take your grief and get out. Just like that. No softness, no hesitation. As if I were an unpaid nanny whose contract had expired. I stared at her for a full 10 seconds before I could speak. She didn't flinch. She crossed her arms like she was waiting for a bus. Like she had practiced kicking people out. "This house belongs to me now," she added. "He left it to me in the will. You're not welcome here anymore. Elaine, pack your things. Today." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that the money for the down payment came from my retirement fund, that I had cared for him every single day while she sipped wine and played the grieving wife in public. But instead, I nodded. I folded the last shirt, buttoned it neatly, and carried the box upstairs without a word. Because what Samantha didn't know was that Matthew had come to me 2 weeks before he passed. We'd had a real conversation, maybe the last one that mattered. And he told me something I wasn't supposed to know, something that would change everything. I stayed silent because timing is power, and Samantha had just handed me the perfect moment. She thought she was done with me. She thought she'd erased me from his life story. But grief makes people underestimate you. They see tears and forget about steel. I let her believe she'd won, that she'd forced me out like a maid with no contract. But I wasn't leaving empty-handed, and I wasn't leaving quietly. Not after what she did, not after what I found in that box under his bed. She had no idea what I'd seen, what I'd touched with trembling fingers that night. When Matthew had fallen asleep after a long round of pain medication, I'd gone into his room just to check on him, like always. But this time something made me pause. Maybe it was how peaceful he looked, how much weight he'd lost. Or maybe it was the way the corner of the rug was sticking up like someone had pulled it hastily. I bent down and lifted it, and underneath, a loose floorboard shifted slightly with the pressure of my hand. I pressed harder. It gave way. Inside was a dusty metal box, small and heavy. And when I opened it, my breath caught. Letters. Dozens of them. Some in my son's handwriting, some in Samantha's, and some in another woman's. I didn't recognize the name at first, but as I read, the truth began to unfold like a slow avalanche. Samantha had been seeing someone else for years, someone Matthew had found out about shortly after his diagnosis. The letters weren't love notes. They were arguments, threats, pleas. I could see his handwriting become shakier in the later ones, like he was losing strength but still trying to hold his ground. One read: "If you think I'll leave her everything, you're mistaken. I've already spoken to Mr. Fletcher." That name made me pause. Fletcher, our family lawyer. My hands were shaking, but I read on. Another letter. "You think I'm weak now, but dying doesn't make me stupid. I'm rewriting the will. You won't bury me and walk away rich." My heart nearly stopped. The next day, I made an appointment with Mr. Fletcher. Quietly, carefully. I didn't tell her. When I arrived at his office, he looked surprised to see me, but then he nodded, opened a drawer, and pulled out a file. "Matthew came to me about 2 weeks ago," he said gently. "He made it clear he didn't want his wife inheriting everything. He was very aware of her intentions." I asked if the changes had gone through. He confirmed they had. Then he added, "There's a clause. Elaine, he wanted you to read it after his death. Privately. That clause. It changed everything." Samantha had no idea she wasn't the sole heir. In fact, she wasn't the heir at all. But I didn't tell her that. Not yet. Because power, I've learned, doesn't always come from shouting or fighting. Sometimes it comes from waiting, from letting your enemy believe they've won, from watching them celebrate their imaginary victory while the truth sits quietly in your purse, folded neatly in a lawyer's envelope. So I nodded when she told me to get out. I packed slowly, made sure to wipe the counters and fold my linens like a polite guest. I even left a thank you note on the kitchen table. Let her think I'm old. Let her think I'm broken. She'll learn soon enough. I returned to my small cottage that night and placed the envelope in my desk drawer, locked it, and poured myself a glass of brandy with hands that had finally stopped trembling. I didn't cry. Not that night, not after everything I'd read and learned, because grief had already passed through me like a storm. And what remained was something colder, something steadier, the kind of silence that lets you think clearly. I spent the next week quietly moving my things, not because I had to, but because I needed to see just how smug Samantha would become when she thought I was truly gone. She didn't offer help. Of course not. She watched from the doorway, arms crossed, like a landlord inspecting a tenant. "You can leave the keys on the console," she said once, "and don't forget to forward your mail." I smiled and said I'd make sure of it. I didn't say a word about the changes in the will, or the clause, or the private meeting scheduled with Fletcher next Thursday. I didn't mention the copies I'd made of the letters, or that one of them contained enough evidence to dismantle her entire version of their marriage. She assumed I'd disappear into quiet old age the way women like her assume all mothers are harmless once they've been emptied of the people they lived for. But what Samantha never understood is that some women become sharper in grief, not softer. 2 days before the will was to be read officially, She posted a photo on social media in front of Matthew's car with a caption, "New beginnings." I nearly laughed. I could picture her sipping something sparkling in my son's leather recliner, probably thinking about how quickly she'd sell the house, how she'd get the car in her name, and how nice it would be to never have to deal with my voice again. But Fletcher had already warned me in confidence. Her name wasn't listed anywhere in the final version, and though there would be backlash, maybe even litigation, the law was clear. Matthew had made his intentions explicit and legal, and there were 3 witnesses from the firm who had signed under oath, and that clause, the one she didn't know about, stated that if Samantha challenged the will in any way, she'd be disinherited completely, not a cent. I didn't even need to fight her. I just needed to wait, so I sent her a card in the mail, handwritten in cursive the way she once mocked. "Thank you for your kindness these past weeks. I hope the car treats you well, Elaine." And I imagined her opening it with that smug little smirk, thinking she'd won, thinking I'd bowed out gracefully, thinking I'd faded into the background like she always wanted me to. I almost pitied her for not seeing it coming, but then again, she never really looked at me. She looked through me, past me, above me, like I was some old chandelier too expensive to throw out, but too out of style to admire. I remembered her once saying over brunch with her friends while I sat in the kitchen, "It's sad when people don't know when to let go." I sipped my tea and smiled to myself, because now it was my turn to show her just how much I'd learned about letting go and what it looks like when someone like me finally does. The morning of the will reading arrived quiet and clear. I wore navy blue, not black, not mourning, but deliberate, a color of resolve and clarity, and when I stepped into Fletcher's office, I felt not like a widow or a discarded mother-in-law, but like a woman finally stepping into her own name. Samantha was already there, tapping her nails on the armrest of the leather chair. Her smile was lazy, dismissive, like she expected a small formality, a box to check before she took the keys to the kingdom. I greeted her politely. She didn't respond. Fletcher entered with the folder in hand, sat down across from us, and adjusted his glasses. Then he looked at her and said, "Before we begin, I must remind you that any contestation of the updated will triggers Clause 9, which per Matthew's instruction immediately forfeits your standing as beneficiary." Her smile cracked ever so slightly, but she recovered and crossed her legs. "Go ahead," she said coolly. "I have nothing to hide." "Very well," he replied, and then he began reading the final will. Matthew's voice came alive in the words, and I saw her expression shift in real time when she realized this wasn't the document she expected. Clause after clause, asset after asset, he passed to me, not to her. The house, the business holdings, the accounts, even the artwork she'd once bragged about insuring under her name. The silence in the room grew so thick it felt like a third presence. And then finally came the closing paragraph, the one Matthew had written by hand. "To my mother Elaine, the only person who stood by me without asking for anything, the only one I trust to carry my wishes forward, you always said love isn't proved in words, it's proved in presence. So here is mine. May this home give you peace and power now that I am gone." Samantha didn't speak, not at first. She sat motionless, then blinked rapidly and stood up to fast knocking over her chair. Fletcher didn't react, neither did I. We just waited. "This is a joke," she hissed. "You forged this, you and your precious little lawyer." He was half delirious. The last week he could barely speak. "That's not what the hospital reports show," Fletcher said flatly, "and the video recording of the signing confirms full cognitive capacity." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw the truth hit her like a glass shattering behind the eyes. All the control she thought she had, all the plans, all the little schemes unraveled like a spool of silk. She muttered something under her breath, grabbed her purse, and stormed out. I didn't follow. I stayed in that chair another 10 minutes as the quiet returned and Fletcher offered me tea. I declined. I didn't need it anymore. I walked out into the morning air and didn't look back. That house that she tried to throw me out of was now mine, not just legally, but spiritually. It was mine because Matthew wanted it so, because he saw her for what she was in the end and saw me for what I had always been. I wasn't just someone's mother or someone's relic. I was Elaine Prescott, and I was finally home. Elaine thought she was being erased, but the truth her son left behind is only starting to unfold. Samantha may have played her final card too soon, and in part 2, we'll see just how much power Elaine still holds and what she plans to do with it. Stay with us. Part 2. She took my son's life for granted. They say grief makes you forget, but for me it did the opposite. It sharpened everything, every sound, every scent, every memory, especially the small ones like the way Matthew used to tap his mug twice before taking the first sip, or how he always left the porch light on for me even when Samantha forgot. I returned to the house a week after the will reading, not to gloat, but because it was time to make things right and mine again. It still smelled faintly of the lavender I'd tucked into his closet drawers, even though she'd tried to cover it with something sharper, something synthetic like her, and yet she was still there. I found her sitting in the living room, shoes off, wine glass in hand, like nothing had changed. She looked up at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So you really came back," she said. "Thought maybe you'd have the decency to leave me some space." I stood in the doorway and took in the view of the room she'd rearranged his books into color-coded stacks, removed every photo of me and replaced them with her own travel shots. Her idea of legacy was Instagrammable grief. "You're trespassing," I said quietly. "Legally, this property belongs to me now, and I'm asking you to leave." She laughed, actually laughed, and stood up slowly. "Oh, please, Elaine, you think a piece of paper means anything? This house was ours. He promised it would always be mine. He said we'd grow old here together. You don't get to erase that." With a signature I didn't flinch. I pulled the folded copy of the will from my bag and laid it on the table between us. "He also promised you wouldn't manipulate what he built." Her face twitched just enough to confirm everything I'd suspected. She wasn't mourning him, she was mourning the lifestyle. She thought she secured the image, the comfort, the illusion of being the one who mattered most. And it made her reckless. She lunged for the paper and snatched it up, but it was too late. I had 3 copies notarized and stored in places she'd never think to look, including one with the firm that now managed the trust fund she didn't know existed. Yet she shouted something, a string of words I won't repeat, and stormed upstairs. I followed slowly, not because I was scared, but because I wanted her to know I wasn't hiding anymore. And when I reached the hallway, I found her in Matthew's office, rifling through drawers, desperate for anything that could give her a sliver of leverage. Maybe a letter, maybe a document with a different name, maybe even a ring to pawn. She didn't find any of that. Instead, she found the envelope I had quietly placed there myself, sealed and addressed to her in my son's handwriting. It was the last one he wrote, with my help dictating each word. When he could no longer hold the pen, I watched her open it, hands trembling, eyes darting across the page. And then I watched her knees buckle as she realized what it was. A goodbye letter, not of love but of truth, brutal, raw, and final. It said, "I loved you once, but I see you now, and I choose my mother not because she's blood, but because she showed up every time you disappeared. I trust her with everything I leave behind. I do not trust you. Please respect that. If you can't, then walk away before you destroy whatever dignity you still have." Her hands dropped to her sides, and the paper slid to the floor. She didn't look at me, she didn't speak, she just stood there staring at the rug like it could swallow her whole. I picked up the letter, folded it, and placed it back in the envelope, then walked past her toward the bedroom. I closed the door gently behind me and let her stand there in the silence. of the truth she had spent years trying to outrun, and in that moment I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. I didn't ask her to leave that day. I didn't have to. Something in her had cracked when she read that letter, and the woman who once strutted through my son's home like a queen now moved like a shadow. I let her be for 2 more days, mostly because I wanted her to sit in that house surrounded by everything she'd almost stolen, but never truly earned. I noticed the change in her posture. No more wine glasses or silk robes now. She sat in silence, scrolling through her phone like it could save her, but it was too late to reach out to friends and play the grieving widow. When the truth was beginning to leak through the walls, she didn't know I'd already spoken to Matthew's business partner, that I had quietly secured my name as the trustee for his investments, or that I'd been in contact with the gallery that had displayed his photographs all those years ago, the ones Samantha tried to claim as hers. When he got too weak to argue, she didn't know that behind every one of her quiet gasps I was rebuilding what she tried to erase, not for revenge, but for restoration. On the 3rd morning, I found her in the guest room, surrounded by half-packed suitcases, her eyes red but dry like the tears had run out. She looked up at me as I stood in the doorway. "I didn't think he'd go through with it," she whispered. "I thought he was just trying to scare me." I nodded, not because I forgave her, but because I understood the truth can feel like a betrayal when it's finally spoken. "You need to go," I said, and this time I didn't soften the edge. "You had years to choose him and you didn't. Now he's chosen me, and I won't undo that for your comfort." She stood slowly, dragging the zipper across the last suitcase, and for a moment I thought she might lash out one final scream or accusation, but she didn't. She looked around the room, the hallway, the framed photo of Matthew I'd already hung back on the wall, and then she said, "He loved you more than I ever let myself admit." And with that, she walked past me, down the stairs and out the door. No ceremony, no threats, no apology, just silence. And when the car pulled away, I finally exhaled, because for the first time in years, the house didn't feel heavy. It felt like home again, not haunted, not staged, just quiet, real, and finally mine. The days that followed were quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Not dull, not lonely, just peaceful. I began reclaiming the spaces piece by piece, restoring the photos she had boxed away, reshelving Matthew's books by subject, not color, returning meaning to the objects that had once held him together. His favorite coffee mug with the chipped rim went back on the counter. I brewed a cup in it every morning and stood at the window just like he used to, letting the light pour over the garden he never quite finished planting. I found a notebook in his office, one she'd overlooked, or maybe never cared to open. It was full of sketches, designs for a side project he'd once mentioned in passing, a little community center for kids to learn photography. He called it Lighthouse, scribbled in his messy block letters with arrows and side notes and coffee stains on the edges. He never got to build it, but in those pages I saw him so clearly that I made a decision. It wasn't enough to just take the house back, or the money, or the dignity Samantha tried to strip from me. I needed to build something in his name, something that would outlive the bitterness. So I contacted his old professor, the one who first got him into photography, then a friend of his from the university. And slowly the pieces started falling into place. We filed the papers for a foundation. I pledged the first major donation from the trust, and within weeks I had local interest, a venue architect, volunteers. It was moving faster than I expected, and every evening I'd sit by the fire with that notebook on my lap, reading his words, hearing his voice in the margins, as if he was still nudging me along, guiding me even now. But not everyone was ready to let go. Samantha reappeared once more, not at the house but at the gallery opening, where Matthew's last unreleased series was being shown. I hadn't invited her, but she came anyway, dressed in black, standing near the back, wine in hand. As if nothing had changed, she approached me only once toward the end of the night. Just as the last of the guests filtered out, she looked tired, thinner, her voice was softer too. He really loved you, she said, no sarcasm, no malice. I hated how much he needed you. I didn't respond right away. I just watched her eyes looking for any sign of manipulation. But there was none, just a kind of hollow defeat. You'll make something good out of this, she added, then walked away without asking for anything, not even the car she once bragged about or the jewelry she insisted was hers. And I realized then she was no longer the enemy, just someone broken by the weight of her own lies. And for the first time I felt nothing toward her. Not hate, not triumph, just nothing. And that was the most freeing feeling of all. The foundation launched quietly, at first a soft ribbon-cutting ceremony surrounded by people who had known Matthew before Samantha ever entered the picture, former classmates, his old photography teacher, two of the hospice nurses who had cared for him and stayed in touch after his passing. They told stories that made us laugh and cry sometimes at the same time, and by the end of the evening I found myself standing alone in the center of the room beneath a large print of his favorite piece of black and white shot of a narrow path through fog-covered woods. I remembered when he took it. He'd told me it reminded him of life, how you can't see too far ahead but you walk anyway and hope there's something good on the other side. And now here I was on the other side, building something he'd dreamed of, watching kids sign up for free classes, touching the very cameras he once held. I didn't expect joy to return to me, not after everything, not after losing him, not after all the silence and betrayal and anger, but it did slowly, like warmth seeping into a cold room. First through the laughter of children who wandered through the gallery, then through the grateful messages from parents, and finally in the quiet evenings when I'd sit by the window and feel him with me, not haunting but watching proud. I donated the last of his equipment to the center, even the camera he used in his final weeks. I thought it would hurt, but instead it felt like setting something free. Samantha never returned, not to the gallery, not to the house, not to the fund. I heard through a friend that she moved to states away, started over, changed her name maybe. I don't know, and for once I didn't care. I had stopped looking over my shoulder because there was nothing left to defend. Everything that mattered was already mine. Not because I fought for it, but because I lived it, because I showed up, because I loved and kept loving, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. And when I locked the gallery that night, turned off the lights, and stepped out into the cool night air, I finally whispered goodbye to him, not with pain but with gratitude. And as the door clicked shut behind me, I knew this wasn't an ending, it was the life he wanted me to have, the one she tried to steal, and the one I finally claimed for myself. Elaine didn't raise her voice. She didn't seek revenge. She simply outlived the lie and built something beautiful from the wreckage. But the legacy her son left behind, it's only just beginning to shine. In part 3, the past comes knocking again, but this time, it isn't Samantha at the door. Part 3, she thought it was over. I thought the silence would last, but the thing about rebuilding a life is that it eventually draws attention, and not always the kind you expect, because just 3 months after the gallery opened, I got a letter, not typed, not formal, handwritten, with the return address left blank. And when I unfolded the paper, I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from her mother, the one who hadn't spoken to me since the wedding, who once told me I'd never be elegant enough for their family, who sent back every holiday card I mailed after Matthew's death unopened and scribbled over with the words, "No longer welcome." And yet here she was writing to me saying she'd seen the article in the local magazine about the foundation. How proud I must be, how wonderful that his legacy wasn't wasted on sentimentality. And then the final line, a dagger under velvet. If only Samantha had been given the chance to protect it the way you did. I sat with that sentence for a long time, not angry, not hurt, just stunned at the audacity of someone Who could erase every cruel thing they said and replace it with pretend admiration? As if I'd forget how she refused to come to the hospital when he asked for her, or how she told Samantha to focus on appearances, not hospice. I didn't reply, but I kept the letter folded neatly in the desk drawer under the gallery front counter, not as a souvenir but as proof of what people try to rewrite when they realize they're no longer holding the pen. And in the weeks that followed, more letters came, some from people I hadn't heard from in years, some from strangers who knew my son's name from old newspaper clippings, all of them saying the same thing, that the gallery felt like him, the light, the space, the warmth. Even the way we arranged the seating for the student showcase made people say he would have loved this, and every time someone said it, I smiled because I knew it was true, but not everyone smiled with me. And that's when I realized Samantha wasn't the only one who had expected something from his death, because someone else had just filed a petition to challenge the ownership of the land the gallery was built on. And when I read the name on the document, I actually laughed out loud, because I hadn't heard it in over 25 years. At first I thought it had to be a mistake or maybe a cruel joke, but there it was in perfect print, filed through the county clerk's office with stamps and signatures, and everything in order. The name was Charles D. Fenton, my late husband's cousin, a man I hadn't seen since Matthew was 8 years old, and Charles tried to sue our family for a piece of the land my husband had inherited before his accident years ago. The same cousin who vanished after losing the case and left behind a trail of petty threats and unanswered letters. I never imagined he'd come back now. Not after all this time, and certainly not after my husband and son had both passed. But somehow he had learned about the foundation and the land it sat on, and claimed it had once belonged to his father and was transferred under questionable circumstances, which anyone who lived through it knew was a ridiculous fabrication. But fabrications can still cost time, money, energy I didn't want to waste. And yet I knew I had no choice if I wanted to protect what I'd built in Matthew's name. I met with the same lawyer who handled the will, the one who helped me stay calm the first time the ground shook beneath me, and together we pieced through decades-old deeds, affidavits, family records, some of them dusty with ink faded so thin you had to tilt them in the light to read, but I remembered every detail because I lived it. I remembered the day my husband signed the final settlement and told me he'll never come back, Elaine, not after this, and how we burned the last threatening letter in our fireplace as a symbol that the matter was closed. And yet here I was 26 years later, staring at a new envelope from a courthouse with that same name and the same signature as before. It wasn't about money. I knew that it never was. It was about legacy, about control, about men who couldn't stand to see something they failed to protect flourish in the hands of a woman they thought would crumble without them. So I didn't panic. I didn't call anyone crying. I brewed tea, sat at my kitchen table, and began writing a letter of my own, one that would go not to Charles but to the board of directors, to the press, to the gallery's supporters, and to every donor who'd ever shaken my hand and told me I was doing something good, because if Charles wanted to stir the past, then I would show him that he wasn't the only one who remembered it, and I would remind him why he lost the first time. The letter I wrote wasn't emotional. It was deliberate, every word chosen like a stone placed in the foundation of something that could not be shaken. I explained the history, the documents, the lawsuits, the closure. I included scans of court records, old tax filings, newspaper clippings with headlines no one had dug up in decades. And I ended it with a statement that wasn't bitter, but final. This foundation was born not of entitlement, but of devotion, not of inheritance, but of action. And the only reason it existed at all was because I stayed when everyone else walked away. I had the packets delivered by hand, 3 copies to the proper offices, and the rest directly to the inboxes of those who mattered the most. Within 3 days, I started receiving calls not from lawyers but from reporters, from donors, from board members who had once kept a polite distance but now leaned in, offering public support, legal assistance, and most of all quiet outrage, not because Charles had filed the claim but because they had seen it before, men trying to reach backward into women's work, to take credit for what they never bothered to build. And while I expected resistance, what I didn't expect was who showed up at the gallery the next Friday afternoon. Samantha, not in black, not in designer heels, just jeans and a coat she probably hadn't worn in years, and in her hand was a single photo of Matthew, a candid one I had never seen. She handed it to me and said without looking at me, "It was in a drawer." I thought maybe he'd want to be here, and for once her voice didn't carry ice. It just carried weariness. I took the photo and nodded, and she turned and walked away. I didn't call after her, and I didn't forgive her, but I also didn't hate her anymore, because by now I understood something deeper than revenge. Not everyone who leaves does it to hurt. Some people just can't carry weight they don't understand, and when they try to hold it, it shatters in their hands and they leave before it cuts them. But I stayed. I always stayed. I stayed when my husband died. I stayed when Matthew got sick. I stayed when the house felt like a coffin. And now I would stay through this too, because that's what legacy is. Not marble, not names etched in stone, but staying standing when someone tries to pull you out by the roots and believing you still belong. The hearing came quicker than expected, and though I'd been through courtrooms before, this one felt different, not because I was nervous, but because I no longer had anything to prove. I arrived early, wearing the same navy coat I wore to Matthew's dedication ceremony, and carried with me not just documents but resolve. And when Charles walked in, flanked by a younger lawyer with polished shoes and a smirk that had never known loss, I didn't look away. I nodded once and sat down across from him like we were two sides of a coin he'd tried to flip for years. We each made our statements, his laced with rehearsed pity and vague accusations, mine quiet, steady, supported by decades of proof and the silent presence of a few people in the back row, board members, neighbors, even one of Matthew's old teachers who'd shown up without telling me, just to sit and bear witness. And when the judge asked if I had anything to add, I stood and said only this: the land he's contesting wasn't won, it was tended, it was healed after everything that tried to break it. And if that's not ownership, then nothing is. There was no applause, no dramatic gavel, just a pause and a signature. And then it was over. The claim dismissed, the gallery safe, and for the first time since the foundation opened, I exhaled fully, not in relief, but in release. Later that week, I added Charles's name to the records, not as a villain, but as a footnote, part of the full truth, part of the family history that tried to bend and failed. And on the anniversary of the gallery's opening, I stood beneath Matthew's photograph again, the one with the fog and the path. And I finally understood what he meant when he said it reminded him of life. Because yes, you walk without knowing, but you also carry every choice, every loss, every name. And still you move forward, and I did not move alone, not anymore. Elaine faced more than grief. She faced the ghosts of unfinished fights, of people who once tried to silence her. But she didn't just survive. She made history speak for itself. In Part 4, the final chapter, one last truth will surface, and it's not the one anyone expected. Part 4, the light he left behind. The morning of the dedication, I woke early, not out of nerves but instinct. Something in me stirred before the sun did, like the quiet had a message I hadn't heard yet. I dressed in simple black wool and a scarf Matthew once gave me, folded the program and slipped it into my bag, and headed to the gallery alone. The air was cool, crisp, the kind of air that makes you feel like something's about to begin, even if it's also ending. I unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and walked through. each room touching the edges of frames, straightening one that always tilted just slightly. And then I saw it tucked beneath the main display, a small envelope, no stamp, no address. Just my name in unfamiliar handwriting. I opened it slowly, expecting a thank you, maybe a forgotten donation, but instead I found a photograph, aged, corners a little bent, but carefully preserved. It was of Matthew standing beside a woman I didn't recognize, taken long before Samantha, before his illness, before the weight of adulthood. You could see it in his face, the ease, the freedom. And on the back, written in his messy but unmistakable scrawl, were the words, "My first teacher, she showed me what kindness looks like. Find her if you can, she deserves to know." I stood there, frozen, tears forming, not from pain, but from the sudden rush of something unfinished, something sacred. I didn't know who left the photo. Maybe an old friend, maybe someone he'd spoken to near the end, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the reminder that even after everything, there were still pieces of him surfacing, pieces I could still honor. So I added a chair to the front row with a card that simply read, "Reserved for the one who taught him kindness." And when people began to arrive, dressed in coats and quiet reverence, I stood at the door and welcomed them in. And for the first time in years, I felt not like someone holding grief together, but someone opening a door to something warm, something whole. The ceremony was simple. Stories were told, music played, laughter echoed gently against the gallery walls. And at the end, when the lights dimmed and the final speech was read, I stepped forward and said only this: "He lived well, he left love, and I will spend the rest of my days making sure the world remembers not just that he died, but that he mattered." And as the audience rose in silence, I caught a glimpse of a woman in the back row, older, soft-eyed, her hand pressed over her heart, staring at the photo wall with a look of recognition. And maybe it was her, maybe it wasn't. But that wasn't the point. The point was that legacy is a ripple, not a monument. It moves outward, touches people we never meet, and I had done what I came to do. I turned pain into purpose and silence into light, and when I locked the gallery that night, I didn't look back because I didn't need to. After the ceremony, the gallery stayed open for those who wanted to linger, and they did, in quiet waves, moving from piece to piece, pausing at the quotes on the wall and the small handwritten notes Matthew had once tucked into the frames back when the gallery was still a dream we shared only in theory. I stayed near the entrance, not watching them, but listening to the way they spoke about him, with warmth, not pity, with admiration, not tragedy. And it soothed something deep in me, something I hadn't realized was still raw. Around midday, a young woman approached, maybe 20 or 21. She looked nervous, clutched a notebook to her chest and said softly, "I hope it's okay, but I drew something for the exhibit." I took the paper and unfolded it, and there was a sketch of the fog path, Matthew's favorite photo, but reimagined in color, with two figures standing at the edge holding hands. And beneath it she'd written, "We don't walk alone." I felt my throat tighten and asked her name, and she whispered, "Jade. He taught me once in hospital art therapy. When he was already sick, he said, draw like no one's ever seen your thoughts before." And I never forgot it. I thanked her and pinned the drawing beside the original, and from that moment, people began to bring things, little tokens, letters, tiny photographs, pressed flowers tucked between book pages they'd hidden away for years. And slowly the gallery shifted from curated space to living tribute, and I didn't stop it. I let it change, I let it grow, because that's what he would have wanted. And that night, when the last guest left and I turned off the lights, I stood in the doorway and didn't cry. I simply said thank you, not to anyone in particular, just to the moment, to the weight of grace I finally felt again. The next morning I returned before dawn, not out of obligation but instinct, and found a small bouquet resting at the base of the main photograph, wrapped in brown paper. No note, no name, just wildflowers, slightly wilted but carefully placed, like someone came quietly in the night and wanted to leave something behind, and I didn't move them. I let them stay because whatever message they carried wasn't mine to interpret. And as sunlight filtered through the gallery windows, casting long shadows across the floor, I walked slowly through the space, noting what had shifted, what had settled. And in the far corner, I noticed something new, a small wooden box placed discreetly behind one of the benches. It wasn't locked, and when I opened it, I found dozens of tiny folded papers, each with a name and a memory scribbled in rushed handwriting. I recognized some of them donors, students, even a few volunteers, but many were unfamiliar names, like whispers from people Matthew had touched without ever telling me, people I never knew existed, and yet here they were, part of his echo, leaving fragments behind. And I smiled because the gallery wasn't just his anymore, it was theirs and mine, and all of ours. It had become a vessel for healing, not just for me, but for others who needed a place to leave their grief gently, not erase it. And in that moment, I realized the power of what we had built, not just a tribute, but a continuation. And just as I was about to close the box, I saw one final paper folded tighter than the rest, with ink smudged and faint, but still legible. It read, "For the boy who saw the world in shadow and painted it with light. You saved me even when you didn't know my name." And I held it in my hand for a long time, not crying, just breathing deeply, feeling the weight of what legacy really meant. Not applause, not plaques, not even memory, but quiet transformation, the way presence lingers in the walls long after the person is gone. The weeks that followed felt like something sacred unfolding, not dramatic, not loud, just steady waves of goodness returning to my life, like warmth crawling back into a once cold room. People kept visiting, not always with stories, but sometimes just to sit and breathe, and that was enough to make the place feel alive, even on quiet days. I began to recognize regulars, a man who always came at noon and stared at the same portrait, a mother and daughter who left daisies on the windowsill every Friday, and one afternoon a teenage boy wandered in, headphones around his neck, and said nothing at all, just looked and nodded and left an envelope that said, "He helped me get through stuff you don't talk about in school." I didn't open it, I just placed it beside the rest in the memory box and locked the gallery with a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. It was never about moving on, I'd finally realized, but moving forward, carrying not just grief but light with me. And then one morning a letter arrived again, no return address, but this time the handwriting was familiar. I opened it slowly, heart pounding just a little, and read the words, "You were right to stay. I wasn't strong enough to, but I see it now. Thank you for keeping the parts of him I couldn't hold." It was signed only with an S, but I didn't need more. I sat with the letter under the sycamore tree Matthew used to sketch beneath, and let the wind carry the moment across my skin. I didn't cry. I just smiled, closed my eyes, and whispered back, "I know, because healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the sound of paper folding gently, the feeling of a hand brushing past in a gallery full of people who never met the man but still miss him." And that was when I understood the truth I hadn't dared admit before, that I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living again, and in a way I never thought possible. I wasn't alone. I didn't know the last visitor that day, an older man with kind eyes and a quiet way of walking, like someone who knew how to carry memories without spilling them. He asked no questions, said no words, just wandered through the space, stopping at every piece with a kind of reverence I hadn't seen before. And when he finally reached the back wall, where Matthew's self-portrait hung, he simply nodded once, then turned to me and said he would have been proud, and something about the way he said it made me believe him completely. After he left, I sat alone in the gallery one last time, letting the silence wrap around me like a warm shawl, not empty, not hollow, but full of everything we had built together. And when the clock struck 6, I stood, walked to the main light switch, and turned it off, not in mourning but in peace. And in the dusk I whispered my final goodbye, not because I was letting go, but because I no longer had to hold on so tightly. The pain had softened into Memory, the memory had bloomed into legacy, and the legacy had become something I could finally set free. I locked the door one last time, knowing the gallery would stay open without me, that others would carry the torch forward, and that my place in the story was not in the frame but in every quiet choice that led us here. And when I stepped out into the cool evening air, I didn't feel old or broken or pushed aside. I felt certain, grounded, complete. I walked slowly down the block, turned the corner, and for the first time in years looked up at the sky, not searching, just seeing. And I smiled, because in the end they tried to make me leave, to erase me, to break me with grief and silence and cruelty. But I stayed, I healed, I built, and when the world expected me to fade, I left behind something too bright to ignore. They buried their legacy in anger, but I wrote mine in light, and now I was free. She was never meant to win, not in their eyes, but she did, not by fighting louder, but by standing longer. Through grief, betrayal, and quiet cruelty, she turned every loss into something lasting. That's the kind of revenge no one sees coming, the kind written not in anger, but in legacy. Thank you for walking every step of this journey with her. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. More powerful voices are coming. Written by Twisted Voices.